Thank you all for joining. Marhaba jami'an. First of all, thank you for the commitment and for joining early this week. Last week, we started at 6 p.m. For our weekly Mazoom sessions because we thought it's perfect time after work. But I guess the topic is incredibly interesting and what's going the financial crisis in Lebanon, such an important topic that we have many people joining today at 4 p.m. US time. Globally, actually, we have folks from Lebanon as well. I can't say more about supporting AUB. I think we've beaten that horse quite significantly in the last couple of sessions, but I really want to rely on your support for the university. As we said, one of the only beacons of democracy in the area and spreading freedom of expression. So we rely on that. The other topic I wanted to discuss is for some of you who are in the US, if you have anyone in your contacts or in your connections who is an activist or a part of ACLU or is someone of knowledge of the civil liberties, we can invite him on our sessions in the next 2 weeks regarding what's happening in the US. So please contact us privately so we can take it from there. Today, we are really excited to have Dr. Hicham Safieddine presenting to us. Hicham is a historian, he's a political scientist, but he's also an economist. And today, he will be discussing the alter ego of Amr Absat that presented to us last week, which was an amazing presentation. He really dissected the situation in Lebanon in a very academic way, very structured way. We were blessed to have him. I don't want to delay the discussion any further. Dr. Ali Halawi will be the moderator today, like last week, and the floor is yours, Ali. It's all yours.
Hi, thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you for the team, especially Justin. Every time I forget to thank him for putting this together and helping and supporting these sessions. Hicham, thank you for joining us. As Mustafa mentioned, Dr. Hicham is both a professor in history. He studied political science and he studied economics. He finished his PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Toronto, and he's currently a lecturer at in the history of the modern Middle East at King's College in London. Hicham has been writing on the issues, the economic issues in Lebanon, and his research is focused on the history of Arab economic thought in the post-World War II, and he's been working on the history of financial colonizations. He wrote a book titled "The Banking on the State: The Financial Foundation of Lebanon," and he published a number of articles. The most recent of them is the one about the IMF, and this is where he's going to give his counter argument to why IMF is not our destiny, why we have other alternatives. He wrote an article in the Lebanon Eye titled "Lebanon Protests: The people want the downfall of the banks. Is that what they want?" That's a question to Dr. Hicham. We're gonna hear from him. And another article in Arabic titled "The Bankruptcy of Mr. Riyad Salemi." So we're gonna, as we did last week, we're gonna give the floor to Hicham to explain his argument, and then we're gonna open the floor for questions. But feel free to type your questions in the chat as Hicham is displaying his argument. Don't wait for the last minute to ask your question. The floor is yours, Dr. Hicham.
Thank you. I really want to thank Dr. Ali Halawi. Ali is a dear friend from a way back, so I'm very happy to reconnect. I also want to thank the team behind Mazoom, and I look forward to having a very productive, very provocative potentially, and very engaging discussion. So I am recently been much more involved in the question of history, but as has been mentioned, I've tried to study history by studying the political economy of societies and states, and particularly the Lebanese political economy, because all too often in the case of Lebanon, we always focus on the question of sectarianism, and as a matter of fact, we have been forced as a society to think much harder about the financial role that is behind the creation of the Lebanese state. There's been a lot of historically as well praise for the Lebanese banking sector. So this is, I think, the first time in recent history after the Civil War that a new generation of Lebanese have been asking about their banking sector, have been asking about the financial foundations of their state. And unfortunately, they've had to do it during a crisis, which today is being there's an attempt to resolve this crisis through seeking the IMF. So what I'm going to try to do, I think it's very important for us to think hard about what it means to seek IMF assistance. Obviously, I'm well aware that the Lebanese government has already went and requested IMF assistance. So when we speak about alternatives, from a practical point of view today, from a state and government point of view, this is not what the government is seeking, unfortunately, in my view, but we have to understand IMF mechanisms. We are going to have to deal with the IMF potentially for 3 to 4 years. So we need to think intellectually about the alternatives first, and then we can think about practical ways in which we can potentially either move away from this alternative before it's too late, or if we don't as a government, how can we actually lobby and pressure to fight back and reduce the negative, largely potentially negative impact of the IMF. So in the time that I have, there's a lot I want to talk about. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible and open the floor for discussions. I'm going to talk very briefly about IMF and the world. So there's a lot of references being made constantly about the IMF has done this in this country or that country. So I'm going to give a very brief assessment of how successful or unsuccessful the IMF has been globally. And I'm going to give you some numbers because I know evidence-based approaches are very much dear and near to financial analysts, and sometimes people who are opposed to these interventions are labeled as being unscientific. And that's, again, an ideological way of undermining people opposed to the IMF. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the IMF and the world, and also make quick references to countries that have been invoked in this regard in relation to Lebanon, like Greece and Egypt. And then I'm going to talk about the IMF and Lebanon. So a little bit about the relationship of the IMF to Lebanon. And in the third part, I'm going to talk about alternatives. How can we actually potentially have a rescue package that does not involve IMF intervention? So in terms of the IMF and the world, I'm going to skip a little bit the historical evolution of the function of the IMF, because the IMF has many functions. It doesn't only come in and give you money. It does economic surveillance, that's their terminology. It's also becoming increasingly a world governance body. So when it comes to the future of our economy, the economy of our region, the IMF is taking on increasing roles because of the lack of a single superpower, the United States, that used to be the case. In terms of the IMF packages or the support programs, the most comprehensive study we have is actually conducted by the IMF analysts themselves. So very quickly, I'm going to share a couple of slides. If you can't see them, let me know. So there was a study that was conducted in 2018 that tried to look at IMF programs around the world from 2011 to 2018. And this is an important period in world economic history because this is after the financial crisis, which is what we have today. We are even having a compounded crisis. So I'm not going to go into some of the acronyms, happy to explain them later, but there are two types of programs that were studied, something called the General Resources Accounts, and the other one is the poverty reduction and growth. And Lebanon might fall under either, most likely under the second. And if someone wants to comment on that, please go ahead. So this study found that 3/4 were successful programs, but as a matter of fact, if you look at the details, you'll see that very successful programs was a mere 30%. In both cases, the numbers are very close. They're a little bit different, but they're pretty much aligned. They were partially successful, 43%, and unsuccessful, 25%. So we know from this study by the IMF that the majority of IMF programs are not successful. That's the empty half of the cup. If you want to look at partial success and success together, 3/4 are successful, and definitely 25% are unsuccessful. So this is in a nutshell to argue that anyone who claims that the IMF is necessarily going to actually rescue Lebanon has to be questioned. So we have actually a solid evidence now from the IMF that this is not the case. Now, the cases that are always invoked about Lebanon when people justify the IMF, they say, for example, look at Greece or look at Egypt or look at Cyprus. Well, I can actually give you I can analyze each of these cases to show that they don't really apply to the case of Lebanon. In the case of Egypt, the amount of money the IMF eventually gave Egypt was 12 billion, which is actually linked to the quota in the IMF. And the Egyptian quota is 4 times the quota of Lebanon. Now, the IMF is not bound by a particular multiple, but that's an estimate for us to think about. In the case of Greece, I'm going to read you what the IMF director of the European department of the IMF said at the London School of Economics. This is only in 2019, so this is less than a year ago. He said that the outcome of the IMF package was much worse than they had expected. 10 years after Greece got IMF support, the GDP per capita, that's the level of growth in that country, is still 22% below the pre-crisis level. And according to the director of the European department, it will take another 15 years until 2034 to return to a pre-crisis level. Obviously, there are many factors why a particular program doesn't work. But the point is, this is a testimony of self-critique by the IMF about the lack of success or failure of the Greek model. And there's an important point I hope we can discuss in the Q&A about the failure of Greece. The director, Thompson, says that part of the problem in Greece was the change in political government. So the fact that there wasn't a consistency in political government created a problem. And I would actually argue that wherever there is a political disagreement or factionalism within a country, there is much less likelihood of the success of the program, regardless of whether I support it or not. And if there's any country that has political factionalism on top of geopolitics that we may also discuss, it is definitely Lebanon. So the fact that someone like the Greek government couldn't actually sustain this program is very likely to happen in the case of Lebanon. The last example is Cyprus. It actually was, according to IMF logic, was successful, but also the amount of money required in the case of Cyprus was nowhere near what Lebanon needs to resuscitate itself. So the IMF and Lebanon, moving on from the IMF and the world to the question of what can, the idea that the IMF can save Lebanon. Firstly, I have to point out that Lebanon is asking for around $10 billion from the IMF. At least that's according to the government plan that we have access to. Unfortunately, there's no transparency in Lebanese government politics. So this is way more than what the quota allows, the Lebanese quota allow. This is way less probably than one is needed to save Lebanon from total collapse, financial collapse. Now, this is seen as a bridge, a financial bridge that will attract more money. And so people will argue, well, that's only a form of securitizing other forms of investment in Lebanon. They are counting on Sadr. So once IMF money comes in, the Sadr money will come in. They think that once that happens, we're going to have foreign direct investment. And again, foreign direct investment requires extreme high levels of certainty in terms of returns. So you need a stable and secure environment to invest there. Anybody who wants to invest as a foreign direct investment. So the point I'm trying to make so far is that those who tell us there's no alternative, not only do they actually close the door on thinking of alternatives, they somehow oversell the IMF. We are being told it's kind of like this is the worst, but this is the only alternative. So that's a very dangerous way to think during times of crises. It also undermines the ability of the Lebanese to negotiate, to better negotiate, to pressure their government. So from the outset, as a matter of principle, claiming that there's no alternative is a dead end. This is something that is used as a form of actually subduing and subordinating the Lebanese people to the potential whims of their politicians. I've heard usually two metaphors in that respect. The first is that we are in a sinking ship. I've literally heard that. And we have to save it. And this is similar to the too big to fail argument we heard in the United States. As a matter of fact, if we are in a ship as a community, I'm not a big fan of these metaphors, but let's try to push them further. First of all, it's like almost a cruise ship where you have the first class people sitting on the very top, enjoying, spending, not even paying their trip for those who do on a cruise ships, they're much worse. And then you have the workers and the people who are at the very bottom, and the ship is already sunk. The difference is we have lifeboats. And the question is, who's going to be on the lifeboats? And this metaphor of the sinking ship is mostly to secure the people who have managed to go on a lifeboat, those who have either smuggled their money out or who are in positions of power. So the sinking ship argument, we've already sunk. What we need is actually lifeboats for the majority of the Lebanese people, not for those who actually got us into the crisis. The second is households. We are like a household. We spend too much. And so, we have to put up with the austerity measures that the IMF brings in. And my response is, if we were to compare, and state finance is not a household, nor is it simply a corporation, although it's much more similar to a corporation, there is a patriarch in the household who is drunk and likes to gamble. And they go and spend their money. This is the government and the banking stockholders, those who control the banking sector in Lebanon, and those who actually run the country. So they are in debt. They are because they are drunk and betting. And you come back and you actually basically detain everybody in the house, and you force everybody, the partner and the children, everybody to bear all the cost. And you actually entrust the same father or patriarch to spend the money you're going to give. So this is what will happen with the IMF. And I'll talk more about that. Actually, that's another important point I want to raise. Sorry if I'm being too quick. I'm trying to raise as many points to get to my point, and then we can expand on each one of them. The elite capture. This means that much of the money, so even if we get money from the IMF, we know again by study by the World Bank, very recent, in February, just 2 months ago, much of the money that is spent, in this case it's aid, but it can also mean funding, is recycled back into bank accounts, or a lot of it in the West. And here I want to emphasize, this is not only a corruption of the elites of the emerging markets or the global South, because this money is then being used by the governments of the West. So they are equally complicit. Both are complicit. So how can we trust? This is a big problem, that if we get the IMF to continue to deal with the same people, anyone who tells you we can't get the banks to bail in, I would argue the same way you don't trust the government to bail in the banks. How do you trust the government? As a matter of fact, this is a lifeline. The IMF will be potentially a lifeline to the ruling class of Lebanon. And it will allow them to continue to use potentially IMF subsidies and support to reproduce their role in Lebanon in destroying the country. If we talk about poverty alleviation, first of all, most of the people affected today in Lebanon are middle class who are being impoverished. Secondly, if you talk about poverty alleviation as cash installments, then this is, you're creating a begging situation. People are dependent on cash. You're not restoring the economy. So we have many structural problems. The last point I want to mention before I move on to potential alternatives is who are the actual people and what are the politics who are going to potentially influence IMF. We know who's actually negotiating on the side of Lebanon. We have the central bank governor and we have the government. And the Minister of Finance today, Mr. Ghazi Wazni, has written in support of central banking policies before the crisis. I'm happy to share some of those documents. And on the other side, we have, for example, who is the head of the IMF for the region of the Middle East and Central Asia? It's Jihad Azzour, who was the finance minister under Fuad Sanyura between 2005 and 2008, and who explicitly called on the privatization and was complaining, according to WikiLeaks documents to the US ambassador, for not privatizing Lebanese assets. And we'll talk, if you want, more about this privatization. So my point is, now I don't know if he has to recuse himself because of his background, but whatever it is, he represents the politics of who is currently in charge of this region. He is influential, and this is his politics: explicit, aggressive privatization. And he has an experience in running the finance of Lebanon. So on one hand, we have Riyad Salemi and Ghazi Wazni and other people. On the other hand, potentially we have either Azzour, or if he's not the one involved because of his conflict of interest, at least he is influential in the region. He directs IMF policy. He just spoke a month ago in April 2020 as part of an IMF forum. So to sum up the IMF alternative, it is an extremely risky alternative. It is also the costs of this alternative so far are likely to be, again, this is all economic analysis. Nobody can control the future, but it is going to be probably very costly for Lebanon. It's going to have very minimal benefits. And I will add, it is going to create a increased politicization, not depoliticization of the situation. And I'm happy to talk more because of the case of Lebanon, because of the situation. So what is the alternative? Obviously, there may be many alternatives. And the starting point is, and obviously I'm not going to provide a comprehensive plan, and I can't do it solo. This is why we need all of us to think harder about how to go about doing this, and potentially preparing ourselves, and many of the cadres who believe in the uprising but are careful to think about the impact of it on the future of creating, and there are actually alternatives already out there, but they're usually not highlighted. So the first point I would argue is, in terms of numbers, in terms of the 10 billion itself, we know that we have, that the profits that the banks accrued, at least between 2011 and 2012, is around 7 billion. We also know, and this is again, all government figures, that a minimum of $2 to $3 billion have been smuggled or illicit, whether non-illicit, outside of Lebanon. So at a minimum, in terms of at least the short term, this is short term, 3 to 4 years, 10 billion. We do have the ability to potentially force a recapitalization of the banks. I'll talk about that as well. We have the ability to recuperate some of this money. By the way, a lot of this money is just on the books. Much of the debt, I didn't talk about the debt, because the biggest problem now is the debt, for the IMF at least, because it has to do with a balance of payments. The debt, we also know, that in terms of Eurobonds, a third of these Eurobonds are only by foreign holders. The rest is by Lebanese. The bulk of Lebanese debt is held by the central bank or indirectly through financed by Lebanese banks. So we have the ability now, if we do cancel some of this debt, it will have an impact on the depositors, and we'll talk about that. But my point is, we have a lot of room, a lot of leeway in terms of reducing foreign debt, negotiating with the debtors, and we'll talk about that if you want, recuperating foreign assets. There is also mechanisms, and the Swiss government is just on standby, as a matter of fact, I can tell you for sure, because I'm involved in some of this work, for the Lebanese government to send a request for those assets. So we have mechanisms in place in terms of the losses that we have incurred. I'm going to show you a few slides now to show you some of the numbers, how we can actually, what do we need to look after? So my apologies, the first time I use share on Zoom. So I'm going to, I don't know why I'm, should I sign in again? I'm having trouble finding where, just a second, where my Zoom is. Oh, can you, oh, have I been sharing the slide all this time?
We can see you.
Right, and I thought I had, okay, I'm gonna.
You started sharing, then you stopped. Now you're sharing.
Okay, so anyways, I'm supposed to go back. So, so in terms of Lebanese expenses, because a lot of the IMF program is about reducing expenses, the biggest chunk is actually the Lebanese debt. All this talk about the EDL, it's much less. It's really, compared to the debt, is very low. We still have to deal with it, but it's very low. The second biggest chunk is public administration and government expenditure. If you look at that, the biggest chunk of that is the army expenditure. It's not even the public employees that are civil administration. It's not the teachers that we keep hearing about. So in terms of reducing expenses, it is mostly the army, which up until today, for most of the time, has been used, with security reasons within Lebanon. So in terms of the debt, 35% of that, we have a big chunk of it that is local, which means we don't necessarily require foreign mediation, because most of foreign mediation is about foreign debt. Now, foreign mediation is about access to capital markets in the future. So there are repercussions, of course. But the point I'm making here is Lebanon is peculiar in that sense. Most of its debt is internal, which means that the loss can be potentially enforced through government policies. And as a matter of fact, much of these alternatives that I've been talking about, even if briefly, are stated in the government plan. I can read you a paragraph from the government plan. Now, the government plan has so many things, it's really all over the place, in which it does call for these things. So if we focus on debt cancellation locally, if we recapitalize the banks, partly through, if you want, a bail-in, a major bail-in, and we can discuss that, we can do without, and if we recuperate some of the interest and the profits of the banks, we can actually potentially do without the IMF. There will be different kinds of struggles, but the question is, why is this alternative unacceptable with all its costs? It does have costs. And why is the IMF alternative with all its potential risks not acceptable? So anyways, I think I am going to stop here. I still have a few things to discuss, but I think at this point,
keep going,
yeah.
keep going.
Should I, okay.
No, keep going.
All right, so I think the final point I want to talk about is the politics. Now, this is a difficult question, but this is very important. If we want to shift from an extremely oversized services sector, which we can't afford anymore, to a well-balanced economy, we have to have options in terms of our trade partners, in terms of our borrowing, in terms of our types of investment in the country. So this means, now bear with me, because the problem in Lebanon is people get overexcited when we talk about these things, and they make assumptions about why you make these claims, but we have to think about these things. This means we cannot simply insist on dealing only with Western governments. As a matter of fact, I should remind everybody when we raise the question of China or Russia, who are the biggest partners of Chinese trade? It's the United States. Ironically, the Western governments don't want us, and some Lebanese don't want us to go and seek that kind of support. On the other hand, many of those calling for Chinese or Russian intervention support are more interested in the politics. So if we want to be a sovereign country, or if we want to be serious about our economy, we have to talk to everybody and decide for ourselves. Who is able to give us a better deal? Who is able to fix, implement a restructuring of the electricity company? We can use that for negotiation purposes as well. Nobody goes to negotiate. In the mid-20th century, most developing countries sought a middle path between the Soviet Union and the United States, called the non-alignment movement, in order to maximize their ability to grow without undermining their sovereignty. So we cannot, in a world that is shifting and changing, this idea that Lebanon's only path to recovery is through Western aid, or in this case, aid from Gulf states, is a problem. And I would argue again, my point is not to say we just have to go and bring in the Chinese companies. No, China has its own interests. China also uses different mechanisms, and there is a lot of critique of some Chinese investments in parts of Africa. But the starting point has to be to open up the ability, as opposed to ridiculing these options, or simply using them as political tools to score political points.
For negotiation power.
Yes. No, I meant also some of those calling to actually open up to China or Russia. It could be simply politically motivated. And my point is that we have to think about it. Obviously, there's politics to this, but my point is the economics of it is there is no reason why Lebanon should remain hostage to, and now this is being used actually against Lebanon by Western governments. I'm emphasizing when I speak of Western powers, I speak of governments. So the point I want to make is that if we are going to reform and provide and choose a different alternative, we go back to square one, that we need a change in political leadership and political government. It's not going to be easy, but this is, in my view, the change. There are examples also globally where there wasn't IMF support. If we seek IMF support, most likely we're going to forfeit our ability to control investment. And I think the biggest winners are going to be the ruling class and the very, very rich. Now, maybe I'm going to now finish with a slide because I forgot to show it to you, and this is important. And I'm going to show you this slide. So deposits, when we speak about bail-ins and we speak about distribution of wealth in Lebanon, this is from Impact for Lebanon. As you can see, less than 2% of depositors have half almost, and this is something I think all of us have heard, but we have to remind ourselves, less than 1% have half of the estimated deposits, which is 80 billion. So in terms of bailing out the middle class and the lower class in Lebanon, it's not a complicated process. Why? Because unfortunately, the concentration of wealth is so high that the amount of money you need to bail out the majority of people, which is deposit insurance schemes, is not very costly. You can pretty much $25 billion, $27 billion guarantee that. Now, how do you do it? Because you don't want people to rush and get their money. We can phase it out. But as a minimum, as a trust measure, they've been fighting in parliament just to bring it up to how much? 75 million, $50,000. So this is where my point is that we cannot trust this current political class to deliver. And this is why we have to work hard to provide alternatives so that if the IMF negotiations fail, or if there's an opportunity to somehow change the political leadership, then there is something ready for that. And I'm happy to also discuss how can people who live outside of Lebanon, the diaspora, which areas we can focus on.
We'll get to that.
Okay, sorry, I'm rushing. So this is my my closing statement. Don't ask what the IMF can do for Lebanon. Really ask what we can do to save Lebanon potentially without the IMF.
On that note, that's the question actually. So for the first slide, you were talking about the success of the programs.
The failure,
and the failure of the programs. Anyway, the way, no matter how you label it. Yes. So there's a question. There's a question from Mira Saidi. She's asking, how do you measure success? How do you define success? Is it by using only the traditional indicators like GDP, growth balances, or does it look at the impact of equity and redistribution? Defining success, and the question that I'm going to ask here is the factors for the success. Is it the IMF to blame for the success, or the country that is implementing the program? And you mentioned that you don't trust the government when you don't trust the team who's going to go to negotiate with IMF, the Lebanese team. How would you trust the Lebanese team, that team, to go and negotiate with other alternatives? You mentioned China and other alternatives. So definition of the success, what shapes the success, and if the factors are still the same, wouldn't we still fail? Wouldn't we still, that gambling household
metaphor,
the head of household, wouldn't he or she still be there and gamble with the money that you can get from the other alternatives?
So the first point about the success, I'm happy to share the whole study, but first of all, there are many financial instruments that the IMF uses and different mechanisms for different countries. And it is most of them the basic indicators, but my point because I haven't looked at the specifics, I've looked at some of the specifics to look at what failed. But the point I'm making is by the IMF's own admission, or at least I wouldn't say, because these are not official IMF documents, studies, by its own standards, or these people's standards, it wasn't successful. Now, usually success means either basically, if it's a strict monetary question, so it's balance of payments, so you return to some level of balance of payments. If it's less traditional, the indicators are you return to certain levels of growth and basically good financial state. So usually most of the indicators used have to do with growth. So you're back to pre-crisis growth levels, and it's the financial state of the government. So budget deficits are reduced, inflation is somehow kept in check. These are the general success levels. But what the actual study does, it's a very long study, and it's actually, I only showed you, there are actually even divisions of what was success. There's also something called signaling. I don't want to get into that. The point is, that's what the IMF has come, these are IMF analysts who are saying. The second question, I don't trust not only the government, I don't trust the IMF either. Why? Because I mentioned who are currently, when I mention people who are running IMF policy, it's not about their person, it's about their politics, their economic policies. So if the people, at least in one case I've mentioned, the regional director is somebody who I believe is not interested in saving Lebanon, and he was actually in charge of Lebanese finances. And also the IMF itself is mostly concerned with fixing budgets. It's not interested in people, what happens to people. It would like to alleviate some of that. It will use, if you read some of the recommendations, for example, it focuses on indirect taxation, on value-added tax. It doesn't talk a lot about income tax. It might sometimes. It always prioritizes a reduction of government.
Like Lebanon, how can you impose income tax? In the recession after economic collapse.
You impose it on rent, so on real estate, and you impose it on the 1%. Or you can do a haircut. Everybody's talking about a haircut. If you want, what is the tax we can do right now? You impose it. And the question is then, are you then willing to impose it on the poor segments of the population? Because it's disproportionate. If you impose it on fuel, we can talk about fuel, for example. Mm-hmm. The problem of the subsidies in Lebanon is not that it subsidizes fuel, is that there is a mediator, a mafia, that actually uses Bank of Lebanon's subsidized dollar to buy fuel at high cost. And Lias Saba, who is one of the most prominent financiers and is a former minister of finance, has exposed the level of which there is no intention of having the government buy the fuel. So I'm getting to your second point.
Okay.
When we talk about China or Russia, I don't trust necessarily that they are going to do a better job. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it has to be at least equally questioned. So you cannot claim that if we go to the IMF alone, we're going to be better off. We're talking about alternatives, if you want to be very practical. We are going to necessarily be better off. As a matter of fact, it is more likely if all of these countries are, if we open negotiations with them, one would hope that there will be more room for exacting better concessions. But I don't trust necessarily that if they bring in, for example, the Chinese to fix the telecommunications, I certainly don't think it's going to be, you know, they're not going to create some form of corrupt management. So this is why my initial point is the alternative. My point is we have to think of all these technical questions. And my point is technically, there are alternatives. So the end result becomes what is more feasible and what's doable and what is the long-term impact of either.
Within the alternatives as well, Monique Nasrallah is asking about the ADB, and I guess that's the Asian Development Bank and the New Development Bank as an alternative. The other, is that an alternative? If yes, how can we capitalize on that? Among the alternatives is a question about the Lebanon's gold reserve and privatizations. Are they alternatives as well?
Okay, so I'll start with and please remind me if I forget something. The first is the gold reserves. This is the easy, for me at least, this is the easier one. Again, by now we know, again, there's no official, but we kind of estimate that there's about 13 billion in Fort Knox or somewhere in the United States. My general position is, in the long run, the dollar, and ironically, we need to de-dollarize for many reasons. Although people now, if you tell them the dollar is not the future, they're going to say, what are you talking about? I can't get enough of getting my hands on it in Lebanon. But gold is going to be increasingly an important currency reserve in the world because of the instability of the foreign exchange markets. So we would make a mistake today, in my view, of using, what we need is to bring the gold back as a starting point. So we cannot keep the gold hostage. We know from experience that the United States on this, and recently Britain, the British, the Bank of England denied Venezuela its right to withdraw its gold. So we have to try somehow to bring the gold back. I don't think we should use the gold reserves. We have, like I said, we can get rid initially of the liabilities on the books. There are ways to do that because a lot of these liabilities are inflated interest accumulated revenues or profits. So we need to do that, in my view, before we go to the gold. The second question was about
ADB and New Development Bank.
Yes, there are all sorts of regional banks and international banks, the Eastern European Bank. There are many banks out there. And again, I'm not an expert on the different...
What's the maximum they can get?
I don't know. I don't have that statistic. And I don't, again, you need to have a team that looks at what it can give. I don't know. I know more about the IMF. So, but the point is we have to knock on all these doors. We need to knock on all these. And the more you diversify, the better. But like I said, the assets, the stolen assets and these things, in my view, because there's a signifier to those. If you do the banking if you borrow from banks, you may relieve the financial dimension, but you're not going to fix the governance. We need to force the government to start making serious changes in terms of how it actually handles its finances. And in my view, we have to do it preferably without the IMF if we're going to create political legitimacy in the future and avoid Lebanon being used as a geopolitical pawn, which potentially the IMF aspect might do.
Sorry to interrupt you, but Fadil Khatib and Mustafa Lamin are asking about your views on privatization, and maybe we can have a hybrid sort of a model where we sell some of the assets, turn to the Chinese and the Western powers, privatize some of the assets. Or Fadi is suggesting that there's a discussion about the sovereign fund where stocks and shares of government assets are offered for investment. Is that something feasible? And privatization.
Right. The government lists make reference to 73 entities that could be privatized. I personally, of course, oppose any kind of privatization today. There is no proof that privatizing will necessarily improve revenues. As a matter of fact, there's no proof the other way around today in Lebanon. Yani Alpha and Touch, they were exorbitantly monopolistic when they were private. And now, according to the latest reports, they are being now divided among sectarian, they are being, the management is being divvied up between the sectarian quotas. So in the case of Lebanon, this is an essential point I want to drive through. That regardless of my politics about privatization, I'm opposed to it. But and I can say more about that. But the point is, there is no good functioning private sector without a good functioning public sector, state sector. That is a myth, the idea of the free market. All markets have to be somehow regulated or deregulated and subject to certain rules. We know in all countries, if there's no monopoly, if there's no state regulation, you will have monopolistic trusts, you will have corruption, you will have abuse, you will have wage depression. So my point is, people who are always struggling about this, I tell them, we cannot have claims today on private companies except through the state. So I, as an individual, as a citizen, cannot. It is only the state that can regulate that. So we need to fix the state before we privatize or sell them out. Because again, if we do that before, we risk both losing state assets, which is the people's, this is the people's money. Are you going to sell the Sikat al-Hadid in order to subsidize and recapitalize the banks? Or that's that too. Fix the subsidies, the mafia of the fuel. Why do you want to? I don't get it. I mean, if you privatize it and sell it low, who's going to run it? And are we going? If we're going to do BOT, which is buy, build, we're not even building. It's not even a BOT. It's going to be a PPP, public-private partnership. If it's going to be totally private, Sukreen was privatized. Look what happened to it. Unless we expect foreign direct investment, which means people are going to just believe. And this we can get to the expatriates, by the way, in the diaspora, because one of the most unfairly treated segments is Lebanese who have deposited in Lebanon. Why are they not prioritized, for example, over foreign bondholders? They are a strong power as a depositors. If they create their own negotiating group, I don't know, I don't have the statistics. And also, by the way, with all the critiques we can have about why people send money to Lebanon, the way money is brought to Lebanon, we know remittances, right? It's a major revenue, source of revenue. A lot of this money goes individually to individual families, which is great because we all support our families. But if there were funds, if this were transformed into funds that could invest inside Lebanon, again, we need proper state overvision, then at least one would assume that many of these foreign investors potentially would have more stake in improving. And there's actually historically, I can tell you about attempts, but I don't know, the politics today of who invests is different, but most of the time, these were never actualized except through personal networks. So you go and you create a conference with, you know, some big politician in Lebanon interested in capitalizing on the diaspora, as opposed to the diaspora themselves organizing as a corporation or whatever you want to call it. So I would say privatization today is very dangerous, or tomorrow. There are, first of all, there are a principled objection to basic services. Basic services are a basic right. This is what the uprising is about. So we need basic services to be guaranteed. That includes health, that includes shelter, education, thank you, and food. So then after that, if you want to privatize, so real estate, we cannot privatize the most important, expensive coastline. They have stolen the public assets from us. So they are going to sell it cheap, they will cash in the money, and we're not going to see a serious improvement. So I think it's a very dangerous move.
So if you go to the reality now, with the current government, with the current governing class, with the current banking system, with the current head of the central bank, and with the numbers that we have in terms of debt, etc. What's among all the alternatives that you mentioned? What's the most feasible right now? People are tired. They just want to know. Carla, for example, is asking about what's the most feasible. And another question that's a little bit provocative.
That's fine.
So the IMF comes with, or the people who are proponent to the IMF program to Lebanon, they actually are answering, or they have a plan for a number of things that are addressed. For example, they have a plan to how to negotiate with the creditors. They have a plan on how to restructure the banking system. They have a plan how to fix the public finance in terms of taxes and lowering spending, etc. And that's what Dr. Amr Bsat illustrated in his last discussion. While people who are progressive, who bring the political dimension into this, they tend to be more into the criticism side rather than providing a well-thought plan or action plan to tackle what we have right now, given what is the current situation. How do you respond?
I respond by saying this is not true. So the first point is there are several plans that have been rolled out, including the plan by people like Dr. Kamal Hamdan. There are studies being put out. People who are not, who don't have this huge opposition, Dr. Jad Sha'ban, I can mention a few people who may not be as opposed to the IMF, but they've put alternatives. So it's not true that there aren't plans. Somebody like Muhammad Zbib has been actually flooding the internet with alternatives, with statistics. I just post statistics for you. So I don't know. I mean, when we post statistics and put evidence-based, we are told we are not scientific. Mm-hmm. And when somebody with the IMF does, now of course they have much more resources. They are in power, so they can afford to produce detailed plans. But there are economic research centers who provide these plans. I don't agree with the criticism. The point about the question of what's most feasible.
Yes.
I'm not talking about the balance of power. In terms of balance of power, I said from the very beginning, people who are opposed to the political class today, there is a lack of legitimacy of our political class, but we don't have an alternative, strong movement with a social base that can actually force more concessions. So I'm aware of that. I have no illusions. So technically speaking, I say start with the debt. I think the debt and bank recapitalization, bail-in, bank bail-in and debt. Now this has implications. It can lead to essentially hyperinflation. It has to be done very carefully. It is inconceivable that almost a year after the bank stopped payment, we don't have a single bank that closed down. It's inconceivable, even in most capitalist countries. So whoever is saying this is, it is inconceivable. There's only one reason for that, is that the people who own the banks also partly control the government. Because historically, we had a crisis, not as big as this one in the 60s. There was a closing of several banks, up to 10 banks. They had recapitalization mergers. I've been talking about this, not just me. So my point is, how can you even start talking about this when you don't even have a law about capital control, single law? We have a total collapse of governance in the country. So I would say, this is why if you pressure the creditors, by the way, according to the IMF, the government plan, if they bring in the IMF, it will create something like a grace period, a 5-year grace period. Creditors, I'll give you an example. In London, we meaning several Lebanese activists, discovered that Ashmore, one of the main companies who actually lends to emerging markets, its office is down the street. We held a few protests. We were going to talk. We sent them emails, but then COVID happened. But my point is, some of these funds, we need to identify them. We need to pressure them. And like I said, it's only 10 billion out of 30. It's not a small number, but it's a third of Euro bond holders. The rest, both dollar and Lebanese debt, is held by local Lebanese. So it is a very clear way. There's a law. You issue a law. Now there are economic implications to it, and you have to be wary of those implications. And by the way, the government plan today has a good aspect. The bail-in, if you look at part of the bail-in, it's there. So if you want to look at the specifics, what do you do? It is there. But you have to decide who has to bear the cost. And this is not being decided by science. This is being decided by who is willing to, or who's more able to protect their own interest. So this is the problem. I'm interested in protecting and saving the majority of the Lebanese people, and particularly also those who spent their lives saving money and putting in the banks, and not people who benefited by 30%, 40%, and later on higher percent interest rates. So, you know, the statistics, like I said, we know how much the losses are, and we can really calculate the equivalence. It's not complicated, but both have serious implications.
Azim, there's a question from Lara. She's saying that based on the Latin American experience, it was not the establishment, it was that led the negotiation with or forced the government to go to shape the negotiation with the IMF. It was the social movements. How do you think that, how can this be attained in the case of Lebanon amid fragmentation of social movements in Lebanon and divisions? Can we capitalize on this? And I wanted to ask you, because I know that we have two more minutes, what can the people who are living outside Lebanon do in order to help in this?
Yes, so to the first question, and they're connected. At the moment, unfortunately, there isn't a well-organized and solid movement that has a clear leader. And when I say leadership, I don't mean some individual.
So the revolution in Lebanon, it's not going to have an impact.
No, history has no end. It's okay. You can still fight for it. It's never too late. You know, I mean, we are going to deal with this for many years. So it's not just going to happen. It's not going to just end tomorrow. We didn't even talk about the structure of the labor market in Lebanon. If you really want to create an economy, we didn't talk about the question of how can you actually bring in more money when there's a global crisis. The point is, today there isn't. Yeah, there isn't. I don't think there is. There's many well-meaning and you know important movements, but they're very small. Some of them lack also the technical capacity. Again, if you believe in it, we should develop our technical capacity as opposed to say, we don't know technical capacity, we're not going to do it, we're just going to relegate to the IMF. So this brings me to the second question. I think people who are living outside Lebanon have a huge advantage. First, because most of them, I don't know what will happen, we have an economic slump globally. They do have some form of income, so they're stable, they're more stable than people in Lebanon. So they're in a much more comfortable position to hopefully work on these long-term projects. And second, they have, I think, two places where they should work a lot. Return of assets.
Stolen assets?
Stolen or that were actually transferred after the 2017. So that should be worked on and coordinated. And the second is the debt, the question of foreign debt. So if they can create mechanisms or bodies or networks to actually pressure, shame, and there's a lot of public shaming that can happen because we see some of these, for example, debtors. The problem is you have to open your mind and start looking to find these things. They are big on social responsibility in emerging markets, although they actually skim off incredible amounts of money by governments in the global south, but they have social responsibility. So if this is the kind of activism you do, you need to pressure these people. But if you have a well-coordinated campaign, it's going to be different from a few of us or some people standing down by the office. So that negotiation, that default, people said we couldn't default. If people remember before the decision was made, or at least to suspend payments, everybody was freaking out. In the meantime, Mr. Salemi gave almost 5 billion over the past year of that payment. So we have a debt freezing right now. Mm-hmm. We don't know what's going to happen because also with COVID, I think there is an opening of negotiating more with lenders, reducing payments, of cutting some of the debt. So again, those are the two, I think. The third, which is much more difficult, is political alternatives. That's also historically was important, by the way, in the rise of politics in Lebanon. Many of these politicians, and including political parties in Lebanon, started sometimes in the Mahjar. They didn't start in Lebanon. And many of them also rely on the support of social bases outside of Lebanon. So the problem is a lot of the opposition to government today is still within the phase of, there's such a resistance. We can, again, don't have time to discuss the reasons, but at this stage, the uprising hasn't managed, for many reasons, not all of it to blame on the activists, there are structural reasons, hasn't managed so far to create an alternative that will provide political change, or actually be a strong pressure group, whether internationally or not, and to create alternatives. So when we talk about what I've shared with you is my own research, but if I were part of a team, if my strength in, let's say, financial history is augmented with somebody's strengths with the technicalities of negotiation, with somebody's, this is how you can create alternatives. But those, again, require a lot of collaboration. Also, you have to see eye to eye. So
a shadow negotiation team.
Sorry?
A shadow negotiation team.
For example, this is like the concept of shadow government. Now, there are, by the way, it's not like there are, I'm aware of initiatives, but we are very granular, fragmented.
Where do we start with a political change? With a political change in Lebanon? And Mira is asking, so it seems, how hopeful are you with a political change in Lebanon given the economic collapse? Do you see it in the future? We've been failing miserably in that.
I'm like many others. I say, it's very hard to speculate. I always use to state my response question by saying, I believe in realism without optimism. So I really strongly believe you have to assess the situation as is, but not defeatist attitude. And then I would say, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So I am actually pessimistic, but by nature, I have to be optimistic. And again, in my case, each person has a different threshold, but I believe that the Taif Third Republic is dying. I do believe in that. I do believe, historically speaking.
Yeah.
And we are at a crossroads. I believe there's the sectarian leaders and the banking community have to reproduce themselves. The sectarians, many of them are at the turning, they're taking much longer than we'd like, but they still have to pass on. This is a moment when, if we have alternatives, we can potentially create a kind of a crevice. But yeah, I don't, in the short run, not very hopeful, no. But when you have big structural changes like today, which is impoverishment of the Lebanese population, either we're going to go regressive again, and this is why I'm worried about internationalization of this issue, or if we have, we're going to create a very positive attitude. So again, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question.
So final question, it's from Nizar Hassan. Nizar Hassan is saying that the activists, the progressive activists, play a different role than a technocrat. So both roles are needed. And he mentioned that Sharb al-Nahas, the political party that Sharb al-Nahas is leading, has presented a plan to address this situation. What's your views on Sharb al-Nahas' plan? That's one question. And final remarks before we close, because it's like 1 hour and 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay, so I thank him because I forgot to mention it, that it's yet another plan that is out there that you can, I'm generally in agreement with most of it. I have my own critiques, but I think compared, but again, I think I don't want to get into it right now, but compared to other plans, now I'm more aware of his political plan. I don't know, we have to be careful. You're asking me about his economic plan or his political plan. So if it's political plan, he's calling for a transitional government. He's calling for what's called exceptional powers for the government. Technically, I agree with that. We need exceptional powers to make changes. But when it comes to transitional government, again, my question to everybody, who are these people who are going to come to, we had the technocratic, now we're living the technocratic experience, right? But these technocrats are partially backed by their parties who are in power. So if you want a technocrats who are not like that. How are they going to, they need a social base to support them, to prevent the powers that be from pressuring them. I don't think we have that. And I would call on everybody, Sherbil and others, create this kind of coalition. Why creating this coalition? That's a question to be asked.
Okay.
But yeah.
Nizar has provided the link to Lihaqi, the platform, so in the chat, so for everyone can access it. I wanted to thank you, Dr. Hicham. It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for your presentation. Any final remarks before I give the floor to Dr. Mustafa for his conclusion remarks?
No, I noticed there are things that were raised I haven't been able to answer, so my apologies. And I would say the alternatives are a work in progress. Mm-hmm. They are not, I don't have a, again, I'm not, the IMF is a behemoth. I'm suggesting that it is a mistake to say there are no alternatives. And I'm saying that the cost of the IMF intervention is likely to be, based on experience, is going to harm the most affected and is going to benefit or at least harm less those that actually caused the crisis. It may alleviate potentially some of the hardships in the short run, but in the long run, it is likely to provide a lifeline to this political class. And we're going to have to deal with this yet another time. So we've had enough, I think, most is generation after generation. There's a historic moment. And if there's a bitter pill to swallow, it should be our own pill, not the IMF's pill.
Shukran, Hicham. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you. I think the biggest conclusion we have from the two discussions we have on the financial crisis is that the debate continues on what is the best solution for the country. I'm a firm believer that going to the IMF will be costly, will come with geopolitical concessions that neither Lebanon nor the area can support or afford. And I'm also a firm believer that the civil society, al-Mujtama al-Madani, can have an incredible impact on shaping the country and its future, and it's already doing that. Kudos to you, Hicham, for shedding some light on what the alternatives are. And I think the alternatives are there. Thank you very much. This was incredibly insightful. A great discussion, Ali. Thank you for all the AUBites, for all the supporters of AUB, for our friends, alumni, and family, for the discussion today. Incredible topic. Hopefully Lebanon will emerge from it strong. God bless you all and God bless Lebanon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Hicham. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Thank
Justin.
you,
thank you. Team in New York, thank you. Take care, everyone.